Like this video and subscribe to the channel to get weekly emotional stories that touch the heart, just like the one you're about to hear. My name is Evelyn. I'm 78 years old. And as absurd as it sounds, I only recently found out I spent a lifetime next to a stranger. For 5 decades, I was married to Charles, a calm, methodical man full of little quirks. He traveled often for work, which never bothered me. I thought we were the quiet, solid kind of couple that grows old together. But one Sunday, everything fell apart. And not because of a passing affair. It was because I discovered Charles had a second life, a second wife, a second home, and all of it for over 30 years. While he slept beside me, hugged me on holidays, and brought me perfume from airport gift shops. This isn't a story about cheating. It's a story about identity, about what's left of us when what we called love turns out to be a lie. I didn't expect to find happiness at 80, but I never imagined that only then I'd meet the woman who had been living in the space where I should have been all along. That woman had a name. She had a family. And above all, she thought she was the only one. Just like I did. The hospital smelled like cheap disinfectant and burnt coffee. I walked in with my heart pounding, clutching my purse like I was trying to hold the world together. Charles had a stroke while traveling for work, and they called me in urgently. When I entered the room, he was pale, motionless, connected to machines that beeped like countdown clocks. I sat by the bed, held his cold hand, and felt a new kind of fear. The kind that smells like the end of a story. It was strange to see that strong, meticulous man reduced to silence and tubes. My Charles, who always knew what to do, who ran our home like a perfectly timed puzzle. I tried to hold back the tears, like I always had. I was never the dramatic type. I took a deep breath, smoothed the sheets, looked at the ceiling, and thought about all the times he had gone on trips. There were many. Always for work, he said. That's when the door opened. A woman with neatly combed white hair, a blue scarf around her neck, and a worried look stepped in without knocking. She froze when she saw me, and her eyes widened. I froze too. She looked confused for a second, then steady. "This is my husband's room," she said. My heart raced. I didn't understand right away. It took me a few seconds to believe what I had just heard. Husband? Hers? I'm Lorraine, Charles's wife. Her words hit me like bricks. My brain tried to make sense of it. I thought maybe she was a mistress, or it was some kind of misunderstanding. But there was something in her eyes that stopped me cold. She looked at him the way I did. With pain. With love. With intimacy. I wasn't ready for that. No woman is. There, beside the frail body of the man I'd shared 5 decades with, another woman was crying. Before I could say anything, a nurse came in and asked us to identify ourselves. She needed to know who the wife was. I gave my name. Lorraine did too. We both handed over our IDs. The nurse left, leaving behind an unbearable silence, heavy as lead. Charles couldn't speak, couldn't lie, couldn't explain. And for the first time in so many years, I found myself facing a void that wasn't just pain. It was doubt.
The nurse returned, pale. You're both listed as legal spouses, in different states, with different dates. That was the final blow to everything I thought I knew. My head spun. Lorraine mumbled, "This can't be happening," through tears. I just closed my eyes. It was real. The man I slept next to for 50 years was the same man who had been sleeping with another woman for 30, and no one ever told us. I sat in the hallway, waiting for someone to tell me it was all a mistake. Lorraine stayed by my side, silent. The whole hospital felt frozen. The cold lights, the metallic sounds, the muffled voices. None of it made sense. I started replaying all of Charles's trips in my mind. Every conference, every meeting, every "I need to handle something at another branch." I never questioned it. Maybe out of love, maybe out of habit.
The nurse asked us to decide who would stay for visiting hours. We both said at the same time that we were his wife. It sounded ironic. Sharing time with the man we loved, even now, unconscious. Lorraine turned to me, her eyes red. "So you're the mistress, then?" she asked bitterly. I let out a dry, choking laugh. "I've been with him for 52 years. And you?" She answered without blinking. 34. I couldn't breathe. I didn't know what hurt more, the time he lied to me, or how casually she said it. It felt like we were on opposite sides of a cracked mirror. Lorraine pulled a photo from her purse of him with small children. "These are my grandkids," she said. I recognized his smile in one of the boys. My stomach turned. Charles was a grandfather, in another family. That also carried his last name. I wanted to scream. I wanted to break something. But I held it in, like I always had. I was raised not to make a scene, to be graceful. But inside, I was bleeding. Lorraine looked at me like I was the intruder, the fraud. And I looked at her the same way. Neither of us knew that Charles had lived a double life. Or maybe he was too much man for one life alone, spread across two homes, two realities, two loves that never crossed paths. Until now. I went back to the room, alone. I touched Charles's hand and whispered, "You lied so well, it still hurts to doubt." His eyes moved under his eyelids. A sign? A reflex? Maybe not even that. I ran my fingers through his hair, now thinning. I didn't recognize that man. He was someone else, a stranger who had slept in my bed. And in the end, I didn't know if I felt anger, pity, or just shame. That night, I lay on the reception couch. Lorraine slept in the chair beside me. We were two widows before our time, two women waking up from a ghost marriage. And even without saying a word, I knew. She was also wondering who this woman was that had suddenly appeared in her grief. And deep down, maybe she was afraid of the same thing I was, realizing we had been deceived. But not entirely. The next morning, the doctor called us in to talk. We need to discuss palliative care. The word hit like a verdict. Palliative. As if his life had already been reduced to that, a temporary relief from pain. Lorraine tensed up and crossed her arms. I just stared at the floor. The doctor explained that Charles would never walk again, or speak, or eat. He'd live attached to machines, if we chose to keep him like that. "That's cruel," I said firmly. "He wouldn't want this." Lorraine snapped back immediately. "And how do you know what he would want?" I looked at her, angry. "I know. I slept beside him for 50 years. Her response was sharp. "And I did for 34. "We're not enemies, Evelyn. We're victims." That broke me. It was the first time I heard her say my name. And for the first time, I saw in her the same pain I was carrying. We sat in silence for a while the doctor waited for our decision. In the end, we agreed to have him transferred to a less aggressive room. We didn't want him to die intubated, between machines and alarms. Even if everything else had been a lie, the love we felt wasn't. Deep down, we knew he loved us, in that twisted, selfish, unforgivable way that only double lives know how to love. After the meeting, I stepped outside for some air. Lorraine followed me. We walked side by side to the garden, without saying a word. Two older women, betrayed by the same man. We passed nurses, patients, visitors. None of them knew what we were carrying. We sat on a stone bench. "You know what's worse?" she said suddenly. "I still love him." I looked at her, my voice shaking. "So do I." That night, Charles worsened. The doctor told us his brain was swelling too much. He might not make it to morning. Lorraine stood crying. I sat in silence. It was an ending without dignity. An ending that came before the answers. I wanted to ask why, how, when. But he wasn't there anymore. And maybe he never really had been. The Charles I loved was now just an idea. A character. a reflection of what I had chosen to believe. I came home with a plastic bag in my hand and a hole in my chest. In the living room, the wedding portrait stared at me from the shelf. I looked at that photo and wondered, did he smile like that at his other wedding too? With the same suit, the same promises, the same lie? I took the frame off the shelf and put it in a drawer. For now, I didn't want to see either of us, neither him nor me. The phone rang at 6:13 a.m. I answered, heart pounding. It was the hospital. The voice was calm but kind. Charles had passed away during the night. No pain, no reaction. He just left. I stayed still for a few seconds, staring into nothing. Then I hung up, walked to the bathroom, and washed my face. It felt like I was trapped in a film with no script. And now, finally, it was the end. No applause, no explanation. I called my son, Thomas. His voice trembled when he heard the news. He was never close to his father, but even so, he stayed silent for a long while. "Do you want me to go with you to the hospital?" he asked. I said yes. I needed support. Someone who wasn't Lorraine. Because as much as she was hurting too, I still didn't know how to deal with her existence. She was the entire mistake made flesh. I arrived at the hospital before Lorraine. I walked into the room and looked at Charles's body. Quiet now. Cold. No longer playing the role he'd created. The wedding ring was still on his finger, the same one he'd put on mine 52 years ago. Maybe the same one he gave her. I wanted to take it off, but I couldn't. The pain was so huge it felt like numbness. Thomas hugged me. He said nothing, just held me tight. And I needed that. Lorraine came in a few minutes later. She stopped in the doorway when she saw me. Her eyes were swollen. She held a single rose. "I didn't know if I should come," she said. I just nodded. "He was your husband too." She walked slowly to the bed, looked at Charles and gently placed the flower on his chest. We stood side by side again, and even in silence I could feel it. That moment belonged to both of us. Sad, unfair, and shared. The social worker came to explain what to do, how to handle the body, the paperwork, the service. When they asked for the marriage certificate, I answered automatically. But Lorraine already had hers in hand. Thomas got angry. How is this even possible? How did no one notice? The woman shrugged. Charles had used similar names, fake documents, different addresses. It had all been planned, all hidden, for decades.
As we were leaving, Lorraine turned to me. "Do you want to hold the service?" I took a deep breath. "Yes, but I don't know how to share this." She nodded. "Neither do I." We fell silent again. Grief does that. It dries up words. In her eyes, I saw the same question that haunted me. What does it mean to be a wife when you find out you were never the only one? The funeral was set for the next morning in a small, discreet chapel, just like he always said he preferred. I arrived early, with Thomas by my side. The casket was in the center of the room, surrounded by flowers I hadn't ordered. Lorraine was already there. She wore a simple black dress and a pearl necklace. We exchanged a brief glance but said nothing. There were more people than I expected, and tension hung in the air like a heavy fog.
That's when I saw a younger woman walk in with 2 children. She approached Lorraine and hugged her, and I knew right away she was her daughter, or rather, Charles's daughter too. My eyes locked on that parallel family. The girl's posture, the boy's nose, even their smiles. It all reminded me of Charles. His blood, scattered into other hands, other faces, other lives I had never known existed. A wave of nausea hit me. Thomas noticed. "Want to leave?" he whispered. I shook my head. I needed to be there, not for Charles, for me, to see with my own eyes what he'd built behind my back. Lorraine's daughter walked over to me and reached out her hand, polite. "I'm Clara." I shook her hand. "I'm Evelyn." She gave a faint smile. "You were—" I was quick. His wife. Just like your mother. The girl fell silent. There was a confused kind of pain in her. Just like in me. During the ceremony, the priest spoke about love, loyalty, and forgiveness. I almost laughed. So many pretty words for a man who took his lie to the grave. But I kept my composure. Because that's what I always did. Because that's what he expected of me. But inside, every sentence felt like a stab. Every memory shared by strangers was a shattered mirror, and I didn't know which piece was mine, if any ever was. As we left, Lorraine's sons surrounded the casket. One sobbed uncontrollably. The other just stared. Thomas stood back, steady but angry. As we passed the hearse, I felt Lorraine grab my hand, just for a second. But it was real. I looked at her, and for the first time, I didn't see a rival. I saw grief, and grief levels even the most unlikely enemies. I took a deep breath. This was just the beginning of life after the end. Back home, I sat for hours in the armchair without turning on a single light. I stared into the dark, trying to make sense of the chaos. On the table, the day's newspaper with a political headline. None of it mattered. The silence in the house was deafening. As much as he had lied, Charles had been my routine. And the bare truth is, I still loved him. Or at least, I loved the version of him I made up for myself. A few days later, I received an envelope in the mail. The sender's name, Clara. Inside, there were copies of documents, photos, and a short note. I thought you should know our side of the story, too. I spread everything out on the table and stared at the images. A younger Charles holding Clara as a baby. Charles at his grandson's baptism. Charles with Lorraine, smiling at Christmas. It was like looking into another world and still seeing the same man. I spent hours there, surrounded by memories that weren't mine. I kept thinking about how many days he had to divide between us, how many excuses he came up with, how many clocks he synchronized. I felt anger. I felt envy. And then, pity. Because now I knew he was never whole for anyone. He was two, maybe more. And in the end, that hollowed him out. Lorraine got photos of me too, I found out later. Clara wanted to balance the scale. I don't know if it helped, but it was honest. Lorraine and I met at a small cafe near the cemetery. She arrived with steady steps, no makeup, her face bare of vanity. I sat down before her and waited. When our eyes met, it felt strange. There was still pain. But there was also something new, exhaustion. "Do you want to know why he did it?" she asked. "I do." "Well, so do I." We laughed. For the first time, we laughed. At ourselves. At the absurdity. At the man who unknowingly tied us together. We talked for nearly 2 hours. We found out our daily lives were surprisingly similar. Charles used the same phrases, gave the same gifts. It was like we had lived inside the same script, directed by some invisible hand. The difference was the set. She lived in another city, with different colors, different details. But the script, it was the same. And that hurt. But in a strange way, it also set us free. Before we said goodbye, Lorraine asked, "Do you think we'll ever get over this?" I stayed quiet, then answered, "I think we learned to walk with it. Getting over it, maybe not." She agreed, and in that moment, I felt something shift inside me, a kind of bitter acceptance. I wasn't the only one. I never was. But I also wasn't less. I was part of it, and part, even if broken, is still lived. I went back home with a cake she insisted I take. I lit a candle and sat alone to eat it. The taste was simple, sweet, human. For the first time in days, I didn't cry. I just chewed slowly, and I thought that maybe, just maybe, moving on was possible, even if it meant walking with broken pieces and scars that would never fully close. Returning to routine felt strange. The house looked the same, but something invisible had shifted. Everything was where he'd left it, his slippers by the bed, his toothbrush in the blue cup. But the air was different, heavier, slower. I began noticing details I used to ignore. The timing of his calls, old receipts, the back of his office drawer. Everything seemed to hide a parallel life. One afternoon, I opened his laptop. The password was our wedding date. How ironic. Inside, there were folders labeled Accounts and Clients, but one caught my eye. Origins. Inside were old photos, short notes, even a spreadsheet with dates. I saw the timeline of the lie. Clara's birthdays, trips with Lorraine, everything perfectly alternated with our moments. A cruel balancing act. I walked downstairs with tears soaking my face. I sat in the kitchen by the old radio and let a song play. One he used to love, and that I later found out had played at his wedding with Lorraine too. The duplicity of it all was suffocating. My love was real, but it was shared. My story was lived, but it was split. And I began to wonder, did he ever mix up our names? Did he ever call me Lorraine by accident? I told Thomas about the files. He wanted to delete them, but I asked him to leave them. I wanted to know. I needed to see the whole of Charles, even if it hurt. Seeing the shadow of the man I thought I knew felt more honest than pretending we were happy. He looked at me with pity, but respected my wish. And in that moment, for the first time, I felt my son saw me not just as a mother, but as a woman. A wounded woman. A woman waking up. I decided to leave the house for a while. I went to visit my sister, who lived in another town. I took the bus alone, like I used to when I was young. On the way, I thought about all the times Charles traveled. Did he look at the scenery and think of both of us? Or did he shut off one world to live in the other? I arrived with swollen eyes and a small suitcase. "What happened?" she asked. I sat down and told her, for the first time, out loud. She cried with me, then made coffee, and we sat in silence all afternoon. Sometimes the best response is not trying to understand. Sometimes you just have to feel the pain until it shrinks a little. I slept there, on the couch, with a light blanket and a heavy soul. And that night, I dreamed of Charles. He was smiling, but I couldn't see tenderness in his smile anymore. It was just the reflection of something I once wanted to believe in. I came back home after 4 days. The suitcase felt heavier, even though it was nearly empty. I opened the door and smelled that closed-up scent, the kind you get after a vacation. But there hadn't been a vacation. There was mourning, collapse, questions. I turned on the light, left the suitcase in the hallway, and walked to the bedroom. I opened his closet, looked at each shirt, each tie, each cologne, and then I saw it. He had 2 identical bottles. One here, one there. I sat on the floor, holding the cologne, and cried, again. Not because I was weak, but because I was alive. Living after betrayal takes strength. And in that moment, I was done pretending I was made of steel. I called Lorraine. "Do you have time tomorrow?" She hesitated, then said, "I do. 10 o'clock. We met on a park bench, beneath old trees and pigeons bold enough to beg for crumbs. She arrived on time, wearing a lilac blouse and a simple bun. She carried a folder. I sat beside her and waited. "Clara wants to know if you'll want a share of the inheritance. She's worried." I took a deep breath. I don't want anything. Just the peace of sleeping without his ghost. Lorraine said nothing, then opened the folder. "But maybe you'll want this." They were letters, handwritten, from Charles to her. Some dated from times when he was with me. I read one, then another. He talked about missing her, praised her cooking, mentioned their nights together. I recognized the phrases, because they were the same ones he told me. Charles was a man who used words like carbon copies. The same, "my love." The same, "you're my only piece." I closed my eyes. The pain wasn't surprising anymore. It was just an echo. Lorraine took my hand, for the first time without hesitation. "I don't know how to deal with this either," she whispered. We stayed there, watching the street. Two women who unknowingly shared the same man. Two lives that crossed paths too late. When we said goodbye, she hugged me. A hug without guilt, without rivalry. Just sorrow. I went home with the letters in my bag. But I didn't read another one. For now, it was enough. I knew what I needed to know. And for the first time, I didn't want to understand anything else. The days that followed were filled with a different kind of silence. Not the silence of grief, but of rebuilding. I started throwing away small things, his old pens, ties I never liked, yellowed newspaper clippings. With every object removed, I felt like I was clearing space inside myself too, as if I were cleaning out the closet in my chest. Not to forget, but to make room for myself. Evelyn, without Charles, without lies.
I reconnected with friends I hadn't seen in years. I told some of them what had happened, but I didn't go into details. Some looked shocked, others just hugged me. One of them, Ruth, held my hand and said, "You survived that, and that's everything." I agreed. Sometimes surviving is the greatest act of self-love we can offer ourselves. I started walking around the neighborhood alone, going into cafes, reading newspapers, breathing. Clara called me. She said her brothers were angry, and some didn't want her talking to me. "They think you're to blame." I gave a sad smile. "Tell them I was deceived too." She replied, "I know, but other people's pain rarely knows how to listen." We talked for 20 minutes. Clara sounded different, lighter, or maybe I was finally able to hear her with new ears. Thomas came by at the end of the week. He brought flowers and a lemon cake. We sat on the porch. He looked at me and said, "You know, Mom, maybe now you can finally live for yourself." That touched me. He had never said anything like that before, as if he finally saw me as a woman who existed beyond being a mother or a wife. I thanked him with a smile. He didn't know it, but those words were a gift. That night, I wore new pajamas and stayed in bed with an old book. Charles used to hate the light on at night. This time, I kept the lamp on until late. I read, drank tea, wrote in a notebook. Loose words, my words, without fear of being read. It was strange and freeing. Was that loneliness? Maybe. But it was also presence. Mine. For the first time, unfiltered, without shadows. When I finally turned off the light, I took a deep breath. There were no more voices telling me what to do, no clocks to check, no lies creeping through the corners. There was only the night, the silence, and me, whole, in pieces, but whole. I received an invitation for a tribute at the company where Charles claimed to work. I hesitated before accepting, but something in me needed to see how far the lie had gone. I went with Thomas. When we arrived, I found out he really had worked there for years as an external consultant. Some employees only knew him as Mr. Richardson, another name, another life. The mask was bigger than I had imagined. One of the partners greeted me kindly. He showed me photos, old reports, and an office Charles used occasionally. There was a mug with his name, Evelyn, engraved on it. I froze. He always said he had a very elegant wife, the man said. I gave a bitter smile. I was his Evelyn there, the official one. But that didn't mean anything anymore. What did it even mean to be official in a world where everything was just a performance? I walked the halls, trying to find a trace of truth beneath so many layers of make-believe. Charles was loved by everyone, seen as fair, friendly, trustworthy. That hurt. Knowing that the same man who lied to me for over 30 years was admired by so many. But at the same time, It gave me a strange sense of relief. At least part of him was good, a part he maybe couldn't figure out how to bring home. I came back with an envelope full of thank you letters and a recognition medal. I tucked it all in a drawer without ceremony. The pain had already become part of my routine, like a scar on the soul. It didn't throb anymore, but it didn't let me forget. I called Lorraine that night. The company held a tribute. She sighed. For him, or for who they thought he was. We were quiet. That was exactly it. We talked for another 20 minutes. She told me about a neighbor who found out everything and made cruel comments. I had gone through that too. They saw your name in the obituary, and mine too. People love a scandal. We laughed, exhausted. Sharing the shame hurt less sometimes. We were starting to form a kind of informal alliance. Not quite friendship yet, but understanding, a common ground of pain. I hung up and went to the backyard. The night was cool and the sky was clear. I sat on the wooden bench and looked up. I thought about Charles, about how he dissolved inside me. Slowly, like ice melting in warm water. There were still good memories, but now there was a new kind of clarity. I deserved more. Not luxury, not flowers, just truth. And from now on, I wouldn't settle for anything less. Lorraine invited me for lunch. It was the first time we entered each other's homes. Hers was bright, full of plants, with family photos on the shelves. I looked at every frame. Charles smiling with his kids. Charles hugging the grandkids. Charles with Lorraine at their 30th anniversary party. Everything perfectly staged, as if I had never existed. And yet, there he was. The same smile, the same expression I had seen so many times. She made lasagna. We ate slowly, without rush, as if the meal were a quiet ritual of acceptance. We talked about trivial things, but also about pain. "Do you miss him?" I asked. She answered quickly, "I do, but I don't know who I miss." That broke me. I missed a Charles who maybe never existed, or who existed only in fragments, in versions, in pieces of truth. After lunch, she showed me a memory box. Inside were letters, notes, a train ticket with my name scribbled on the back. I found this strange. Now I understand. He had used an old ticket of mine to write her a love note. The blending of worlds was everywhere. I didn't know whether to cry, laugh, or apologize. The truth was, there were no villains, just survivors. Lorraine said she was thinking of selling the house, starting over. I understood. That house, beautiful as it was, had been a stage, just like mine. Everything there still smelled like him, and sometimes that suffocated. "Maybe I'll move too," I said. She smiled. "Want to come with me?" It was a joke, but something in me stirred, because as absurd as it sounded, it didn't feel wrong, it felt possible. We said goodbye with a long hug, and I realized I was starting to feel real affection for her. Not because we were friends, but because we were sisters in ruin, companions in a kind of grief that's impossible to explain. In pain, we found empathy, and in empathy, something new was born, still small, but alive and real. I came back home and sat in the living room in silence. I, who always thought I'd grow old next to one great love, now looked at my life with different eyes. Aging isn't the end. It's discovery, sometimes late, sometimes cruel, but still capable of opening doors, even when everything seems locked. I started writing, not a book, just loose pages, small fragments of what I lived, what I felt, what I had to bury without a funeral. I wrote in the afternoons, with a cup of tea and instrumental music playing. It felt like reorganizing my world, word by word, tear by tear. I didn't write for anyone to read. It was for me, to understand, to let it out. Because keeping things in for too long hurts more than any betrayal. I sent one of the pages to Lorraine, a passage where I talked about the day I found a photo of Charles in the printer trash bin, labeled Charles, the ideal husband. She replied the same day with a passage of her own. That's how it started, sharing texts, fragments, wounds, reliefs. It was strange, but healing. For the first time, we shared something that wasn't him. It was ours. It was honest. Thomas told me he was worried, that maybe I was getting too attached to Lorraine. You only have him in common, Mom. I looked at him with tenderness. And that's so much more than it sounds. He didn't understand right away, but then he kissed my forehead and apologized. I knew he was trying to protect me, but I also knew some bonds are born in places no one else can reach, and that can't be explained. I started thinking about a trip, maybe to the countryside, maybe to a place I'd never been with Charles, a place that would be mine alone. I opened an old map and ran my fingers over small town names. I wanted nature, silence, time. I called Lorraine and shared the idea. Want to go together? I asked. She went silent for a few seconds, then answered, yes. And right then, for the first time, I felt something new, lightness. That trip wouldn't be an escape. It would be a beginning. Two unlikely widows, rebuilding their identities without the shadow of a man who lied to them both. A kind of honeymoon with our own truths. No rings, no promises, just the freedom to be whole. Afraid, maybe, but brave enough to take the first step. I packed a small suitcase. I placed a coat, a pair of comfortable shoes, my notebook, and a photo of myself smiling, alone. I also grabbed an envelope of old saved money. And before I left, I looked around the house. I didn't say goodbye. I just let the door close behind me. Sometimes, the beginning of everything is the sound of a door quietly shutting behind you. We arrived at the small village in the late afternoon. The inn was simple, scented with old wood and jasmine. The room had 2 beds, open windows, and curtains swaying with the breeze. Lorraine placed her suitcase next to mine and smiled. It's been a long time since I shared a room with another woman, she joked. I laughed. Me too. But what I felt wasn't discomfort. It was relief. Being there with her felt like breathing outside the story for the first time. We went for a walk before dinner. Cobblestone streets, orange sky, people waving kindly. Nothing there reminded me of Charles. And maybe that's why it was the right place. We stepped into a tiny bookstore, then a fabric shop. We bought 2 scarves, same pattern, different colors. Like 2 versions of the same life, Lorraine said. That stayed with me, because that's exactly what we lived. One life, split into 2 shades. We had pumpkin soup with homemade bread. We talked about our children, our granddaughters, old recipes. For the first time, we talked about ourselves, without Charles. I learned Lorraine loved ballroom dancing and once sang in a choir. She learned I'd always wanted to learn French, but never dared. It was as if we had hijacked our own lives for so long that now we were learning to live again. Like white-haired teenagers, we went back to the inn and sat on the porch. The sky was full of stars. She told me a childhood story. I shared one too. Then we sat in silence. And what a beautiful silence it was. Full of presence, full of listening. There was no competition, no past. Just 2 women with scars that recognized each other. It was a new kind of tenderness, strange and familiar at the same time. The next morning, we had breakfast together and left with no rush. We visited a small craft market and bought tiny souvenirs. I picked a ceramic bird. She picked a blue teacup. We laughed at the simplicity of it all. Do you think if he saw this, he'd think we lost our minds? I asked. She replied, I think, for the first time, he wouldn't recognize us. And that's a good thing. On the last night of the trip, we toasted with white wine and said in unison, "To life after the chaos." We went to bed early, and I dreamed. I dreamed Charles appeared, but faceless, and I left him in the middle of a road without looking back. When I woke up, I looked at the ceiling and smiled. It was just a dream, but it said everything. We came back from the trip with less weight in our bags and more space inside ourselves. Lorraine got off at the next town station. I went home by train, soft music in my ears. Trees passed by the window like memories that no longer hurt as much. When I got home, everything was still in place, but I wasn't. I opened the windows, washed my face, sat in the armchair, and let the sun come in. Thomas stopped by that evening, told me about work, the kids, showed me photos. I watched him more closely, and I realized he had his father's features, but not his absence. Thomas was whole, present, loyal, and that calmed me. He asked if I was okay. I told him I was at peace. Peace comes with noise sometimes, my son. It comes after the earthquake. He nodded. He understood. At the end of the night, he handed me an envelope. I found this among Dad's papers. It was a letter, written by Charles, addressed to me, but never sent. I sat on the bed with it in my lap, opened it gently. It began, "Evelyn, I don't know if you'll ever discover everything, but if you do, I hope you hate me less than I deserve." The rest of the letter was confusing. He tried to explain, asked for forgiveness, said he loved me, admitted he failed. I finished reading with wet eyes, folded the paper and slipped it into my notebook. I didn't know if I believed it, or if I even wanted to, but I understood one thing. He was a fragile man, cowardly, human. As I closed the notebook, I realized it no longer hurt like before. Not because I forgave him, but because I chose not to carry what was his anymore. I already had enough to tend to within myself. In the following days, I started making small changes around the house. Donated clothes, switched the curtains, painted one wall yellow. It felt like I was cleaning my soul with paint, fabric, and light. Lorraine called almost every day. We talked about the present, about recipes, movies, different ways of aging. Charles's absence slowly turned into a new kind of space, a place where I could exist without shadow. One Saturday, Lorraine texted me, "Do you think we can be happy again?" I thought for a while before replying. Then I wrote, "I don't know if it'll be like before, but in a more honest way, yes, I think we can." She replied with a heart emoji, and I understood. Even at the end of the road, we can still find bits of sky, small ones maybe, but real. And that, for me, was everything. I started going to a reading group at the local library. People my age, full of stories, and silences too. Every meeting was a discovery. I read aloud bits of what I'd written. Some were moved. Others came to speak with me afterward. I felt something inside me slowly blooming. It wasn't loud happiness. It was calm, a kind of dignity that only well-healed pain brings. A woman named Norma said, "You have a voice that heals, you know?" I didn't know what to say, but I held on to those words. The idea that, after hiding the truth for so long, I could now turn it into a bridge. What once hurt me now connected me, as if pain, when polished, could become a lighthouse, for me and for others. I realized I didn't want silence anymore. I wanted to share. I invited Lorraine to one of the meetings. She came, read a piece about the fear of starting over at 70. She was applauded. Her eyes were shining when we left. On the way home, she said, "You know, Evelyn, if someone had told me I'd find peace beside my husband's wife, I would have laughed." I laughed too. Life loves to prove us wrong. And right there, on that bus bench, two women looked at each other without resentment, just respect. We decided to take a small trip every month. Nothing grand, just one day away, a walk, a cafe in another town. It was our way of marking time with beauty, not for luxury, but because we deserved it. Not because of the past, but in spite of it. Because you don't have to erase pain to make room for joy. You just have to stop letting it rule everything. And that, we both learned the hardest and most honest way. On one of those trips, we visited an old church. We lit candles, sat in silence. I didn't ask for anything. I just gave thanks for strength, for the encounter, for the courage to not fall apart completely. Lorraine hugged me there, in front of the empty altar. A long, mature hug, the kind you give when you've lost everything, and somehow still found a way to go on. On the train ride back, I wrote one sentence in my notebook. What hurt me doesn't define me. What I did with the pain does. And I closed the page, knowing the worst had passed, and that even marked, I was still mine, whole, slow, but mine. The months passed with a kind of calm I had never known before. It wasn't monotony, it was peace. I started waking up early just to watch the backyard light up. I began caring for the plants more patiently, listening to the birds more attentively. Life began to move at another rhythm, my rhythm. No waiting, no explaining. And fewer memories of Charles showed up in my mornings. Lorraine and I talked nearly every day, sometimes over coffee, sometimes on walks through the park. It no longer felt strange. It no longer hurt. It just was. Two women who survived the same betrayal and chose not to live inside it anymore. We started planning a small exhibition of our writings. Nothing big, just something to share with other women our age, to show that yes, it's still possible. The library group grew. Other widows joined, some deceived, some not, but all with cracked stories. And there, in our meetings, what used to be a wound became voice, became laughter, became bridge. One of them said, "You two gave me courage." Lorraine and I looked at each other surprised. We'd never thought of ourselves as examples, but maybe we were. An example of what survives. One Sunday, I ran into Clara by chance. She was with her kids, now older. We sat for ice cream, talked lightly. She told me about school, plans, pains that still visit. "Sometimes I still hate my father," she said. I understood. I hated him too sometimes. Other times, I just forgot. But what became clear in that late afternoon was that things had moved elsewhere. They didn't hurt like before. On the way home, I realized I'd spent the entire day without thinking of Charles, not even once. And that, for me, meant more than any anniversary. It was proof that his absence had finally become neutral, no longer a knife, not even a scent, just an absence, a name from the past, a memory with no fixed owner. Before bed, I turned on the lamp, wrote one more page, and closed the notebook with purpose. It was a light page, about hydrangeas and cakes that never rise. Nothing about him, everything about me. And for the first time, I felt proud. Not of winning, but of continuing, of having found space inside the pain and made a home there. This morning, I woke up with sunlight filtering through the curtains and a calm in my chest I can't name. I made coffee, put on music, and looked at myself in the mirror with tenderness. I'm 78 years old, and I started over at 78, not by choice, but out of necessity. And still, what a blessing to have started over. Not all pain turns into healing, but some pain becomes ground. And walking on solid ground is all I needed now. Charles became the past, Lorraine became presence, and I became someone I choose every single day, I keep writing. I keep watering the plants. Sometimes I still cry. But now, I laugh too. I've learned I don't have to shrink to fit what others expected of me. I've learned I can say no, that I can change my mind, that I can leave, even without knowing where to go. And that set me free. I never imagined that such a deep betrayal would lead me to such an honest encounter with myself. Life is ironic, and sometimes fair in its own crooked way. Lorraine and I are publishing our little book next month. We're calling it Two Halves. Not because we're incomplete, but because we were broken and pieced ourselves back together from within. With words, with courage, with gentleness. If someone asked me today who I am, I would answer calmly, I'm Evelyn. I was Charles's wife. I was deceived. I was forgotten. But now, I am whole. My story doesn't end with marriage or pain. It keeps going. With new affections, with new discoveries, with a freedom that came late, but still came in time. Not everything can be fixed. Not everything needs to be. Sometimes, we just need to live with the pieces that remain and learn to love them. And that's what I did. Clumsily. But I did it. And if you made it this far, listening to my story, just know it's never too late to choose yourself.